I
I just
kissed my
kissed my
boss,
boss, and he kissed
and
me
he
back.
kissed me back.
Georgina confessed to her best friend, her voice shaking so hard the phone nearly slipped from her hand. On the other end, Ngozi went dead silent for 3 full seconds before she screamed. "You did what?" "I don't know how it happened, Ngozi. 1 minute I was apologizing for knocking over his files, and the next, Georgina pressed her palm to her chest like she could hold her heart in place. The next his mouth was on mine, and I forgot my own name. Georgina. Georgina, listen to me. Do you even know who that man is? Do you know what they call him in the streets?" "I know what they call him," Georgina whispered, sinking onto the edge of her narrow bed in her one-room apartment in Itaewon, the city lights of Seoul blinking through a window too thin to keep out the cold. "They call him the king. They call him a monster. But Ngozi, when he looked at me tonight, I didn't see a monster. I saw a man who looked like he hadn't been touched with kindness in years." Ngozi's voice dropped low, urgent. "Girl, kindness will get you killed. Choi Kang-woo doesn't fall in love. He ends people. You clean his floors, you don't kiss his mouth." But Georgina couldn't unfeel it. Couldn't unfeel the way his hands had trembled, actually trembled, before he'd cupped her face like she was something breakable and precious in a world that had only ever handed him weapons. She hadn't planned any of this. 6 months ago, Georgina Okafor had landed at Incheon International Airport with 2 suitcases, expired visa applications she was still fighting to renew, and a promise she'd made to herself back in Lagos. "I will not go back home broken." Her mother had cried at the departure gate, clutching Georgina's hands like she might vanish. "Seoul is far, my daughter. Who will hold you when you cry?" "I'll hold myself, Mama," Georgina had said, and she believed it, because belief was the only currency she had left. The job came through a Nigerian pastor's wife she'd met at a small immigrant church in Hongdae, a cleaning contract with a private security firm that served, the pastor's wife said carefully, important people. Georgina hadn't asked too many questions. Rent was due. Her student loan back home was compounding interest like a curse. She needed the money, and the money was good. Suspiciously, dangerously good for mopping floors and emptying trash bins in a glass tower that smelled like money and something colder underneath it. The first time she saw him, she nearly dropped her cleaning cart. He walked through the marble lobby of Kong Group Holdings like the building itself had been built around the shape of his shoulders. Tall, black suit cut so precisely it looked like armor, jaw set in a permanent line that dared anyone to speak to him without invitation. 2 men flanked him, hands folded, eyes scanning every corner. The lobby, usually filled with quiet chatter, fell into a silence so complete Georgina could hear her own cart wheel squeak against the floor. "Who is that?" she'd whispered to another cleaner, an older Korean woman named Mrs. Han. Mrs. Han hadn't even looked up from her mop. "That is Choi Kang-woo. Don't look at him directly. Don't speak unless spoken to. Do your job, collect your pay, go home. That is how you survive here." Georgina had nodded, tucked her chin down, and gone back to wiping the same spotless counter for the 3rd time, heart hammering. For weeks, that was the rule she lived by. She saw him in fragments, the back of his coat disappearing into the private elevator, his voice, low and clipped, giving orders in Korean she was only beginning to understand, the way every single person in that building moved like they were walking on glass whenever he was near. He never looked at the cleaning staff. Not once. Georgina told herself that was fine. Better than fine. Invisible was safe. Then came the night everything cracked open. It was past 11, and Georgina was the only one left on the executive floor, running a vacuum along the corridor outside his office when she heard it, a sound she wasn't supposed to hear. A glass shattering. Then silence. Then something that made her stomach drop, a low, ragged breath, like a man trying not to fall apart and losing that fight. Every instinct told her to leave. Mrs. Han's warning rang in her ears, don't look at him directly, don't speak unless spoken to. But something in that sound reached into Georgina's chest and pulled. She knocked on his office door before she could stop herself. "Mr. Choi, are you all right?" No answer. She pushed the door open a crack. He was standing by the window, his back to her, one hand braced against the glass, the other clutching his side where dark red had already soaked through his white shirt. On the floor near his desk, a shattered whiskey glass glittered under the light like broken ice. "Get out," he said, voice like gravel dragged over stone. "Now." Georgina should have listened. Every survival instinct in her body screamed at her to obey. Instead, she found herself crossing the room, pulling off her cleaning apron, folding it into a makeshift pressure bandage. "You're bleeding," she said, kneeling beside him despite the way his whole body went rigid at her closeness, despite the flicker of something dangerous in his eyes when he finally turned to look at her, really look at her, for the very first time. "I said get out," he repeated, but this time his voice cracked, just slightly, on the last word. Georgina pressed the folded fabric to his side anyway, steady hands against a man the whole city feared to breathe near. "You can be the most powerful man in Seoul," she said softly, "and still let someone help you. That's not weakness. That's just being human." He didn't call for his men. He didn't call for a doctor. He let a stranger in a cleaner's uniform press her palm against the wound at his side, and something in his chest, something that had been locked so tightly for so long he'd forgotten it could move, shifted. "What's your name?" he asked finally, his voice rougher than he intended. "Georgina," she said. "Georgina Okafor." "You're not Korean." "No. Nigerian. I moved here 6 months ago." She kept pressure on the wound, refusing to let her hands shake even though her heart was slamming against her ribs. "You should be at a hospital, not bleeding out in an office." "Hospitals ask questions." His jaw tightened. "I don't answer questions." "Then answer mine." "What happened?" He almost laughed, an ugly, disbelieving sound, like no one had dared question him in years. "A disagreement. With a business associate who forgot his place." Georgina didn't flinch, though her stomach turned at the casual violence in his tone. "Well, your business associate left a mess." "Hold still." She helped him to the leather sofa against the wall, tore the bandage from her apron tighter around his ribs, and for the next 20 minutes, worked in silence while he watched her with an intensity that made her skin prickle, not with fear, but with something far more dangerous. Curiosity. Attention. The particular heat of being seen by a man who saw everyone as either useful or expendable, and had apparently just discovered a third category he didn't have a name for yet. "You should be terrified of me," he said quietly when she finally sat back, her hands stained red. "I am," Georgina admitted. "But you're also hurt, and no one else is here to help you. So I'm terrified and I'm helping you. Both things can be true." Something flickered behind his dark eyes. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. "Most people who work for me would have run." "I'm not most people." "No," he murmured, studying her like she was a puzzle he suddenly, desperately wanted to solve. "You're not." That night became the first thread in something neither of them could name. He didn't summon her again, not directly. But Georgina began noticing small things. Her shifts, somehow, always overlapped with his late nights now. A driver appeared to take her home when the train stopped running, no explanation given, no room to refuse. Once, she found an envelope of cash on her cart with no note, and when she tried to return it to HR, she was told, quietly, that Mr. Choi's assistant had authorized hazard pay for staff working past midnight. She was the only one working past midnight. "He's watching you," Mrs. Hahn warned one afternoon, eyes darting toward the executive floor. "Be careful, Georgina. Men like him don't watch women they intend to let go." "I'm not doing anything wrong," Georgina said, though her pulse quickened at the thought of his eyes finding her in a crowded lobby, dark and unreadable and undeniably present in a way they'd never been before that night. 3 weeks later, he found her on the rooftop garden where she sometimes ate her lunch alone, away from the whispers of coworkers who'd started to notice the driver, the envelope, the way Kang-woo's expression changed, barely, almost imperceptibly, whenever her name came up. "You've been avoiding me," he said, hands in his coat pockets, standing at a distance like he wasn't sure he was welcome. "I work here, Mr. Choi. I don't avoid my job. You avoid me." Georgina set down her lunch, heart hammering. "Is that a problem?" "Yes," he said, and the honesty in it startled her more than any threat could have. "It's a very large problem." "Why?" He crossed the rooftop slowly, each step deliberate, until he stood close enough that she had to tilt her head to hold his gaze. Up close, she could see what the boardroom lighting hid, the faint scar along his jaw, the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes, the loneliness he wore like a second suit beneath the tailored one. "Because I haven't been able to stop thinking about a cleaning woman who wasn't afraid to bleed for a stranger," he said quietly. And men like me are not supposed to think about anyone. Georgina's breath caught. Why not? Because everyone I have ever cared about, he said, voice low and rough with something that sounded dangerously close to grief, has either used me or left me in the ground. My father was murdered when I was 9. My mother disappeared before I turned 10. Some say she ran, some say my uncle had her removed so she couldn't interfere with his plans for me. I was raised by the man who may have orchestrated both. I have spent 25 years learning that trust is a knife with the handle always pointed at me. Georgina's chest ached, sharp and sudden, at the rawness in his confession, a king of the underworld, undone not by bullets or rivals, but by the simple, devastating admission of a boy who'd never been allowed to grieve. That's not fair, she whispered. A child shouldn't have to survive that alone. I wasn't alone. I had power. Power doesn't grieve. Power doesn't need anyone. His eyes locked on hers, dark and searching. Until you patched a hole in my side and looked at me like I was a man, not a monster. The wind moved between them, carrying the hum of Seoul far below, and Georgina realized, with a jolt that terrified her more than his reputation ever had, that she wanted to close the distance between them. Georgina, he said, her name unfamiliar and reverent on his tongue, like he was testing whether he was allowed to want something for himself for the first time in his life. Tell me to leave, and I will. She didn't tell him to leave. She should have told him to leave. Every rational part of her screamed it, Mrs. Han's warnings, Ngozi's voice in her head, her mother's face at the departure gate. Instead, Georgina reached up and rested her palm against his jaw, feeling the muscle tighten beneath her fingers like he was holding himself together by will alone. I'm not going to tell you to leave, she whispered. But I need you to know something first. I didn't help you that night because of who you are. I helped you because you were a person who was hurting, and I couldn't walk past that. If tomorrow you go back to being the man everyone fears, and you forget this conversation ever happened, I'll understand. But I won't pretend I don't feel something when you look at me like this. Like what? Like I'm the only real thing in your entire life. His breath left him in a broken exhale, and then his hand was cupping her face, trembling. She'd remember that trembling for the rest of her days, the way the most feared man in Seoul shook like a boy the first time he let himself want something softly instead of taking it by force. You are, he said, and kissed her. It wasn't gentle at first, it was desperate, like a drowning man finally allowed to breathe, and Georgina kissed him back with equal desperation, her fingers curling into his lapels, her heart pounding out a rhythm that felt like falling and flying at once. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathless, Kang-woo pressed his forehead to hers. This is dangerous, he murmured. Everyone who gets close to me becomes a target. I know. I mean it, Georgina. My enemies would burn down the whole city to take something from me that matters. If they learn you matter, then we'll be careful. She pulled back just enough to look him in the eyes, refusing to let fear win before it even had a chance to try. I didn't survive leaving my whole family behind, crossing an ocean with nothing but 2 suitcases and a prayer, just to run from the first thing that's ever made me feel wanted for exactly who I am. I'm not running, Kang-woo. It was the first time she'd said his given name instead of his title, and something in his face broke open at the sound of it, like no one had called him simply Kang-woo, without fear or flattery attached, in more years than he could count. That was how it began. Quiet moments stolen on rooftops. Late-night conversations in his office long after the building emptied, where he told her about the mother he barely remembered and the uncle, Choi Dae-sung, who had raised him with an iron fist and a smile that never reached his eyes. Where Georgina told him about Lagos, the smell of fried plantain on Sunday mornings, her mother's laughter, the ache of being the first in her family to leave everything behind for a future no one back home could quite picture. You remind me of her, he admitted one night, watching Georgina from across his desk as she organized files she had no real reason to be organizing, just an excuse to stay near him a little longer. My mother. Not in how you look. In how you are. Warm. Unafraid. My uncle used to say warmth was a weakness bred into people who'd never held real power. I used to believe him. And now I think he was wrong about everything that ever mattered. Weeks folded into a month, and Georgina found herself falling deeper than she'd ever intended, drawn not to the king of Seoul's underworld but to the boy underneath the armor, the one who flinched at loud noises from childhood memories he never fully explained, who ate his meals too fast like he still remembered hunger, who looked at her sometimes like she was the only soft thing he'd ever been allowed to keep. But danger had a way of finding softness and aiming straight for it. It started small, a stare held too long from Choi Dae-sung during a company gala Georgina had been quietly invited to as Kang-woo's guest, dressed in a borrowed gown that made her feel like Cinderella standing in a room full of wolves. Dae-sung's smile was warm, practiced, the kind that had probably charmed boardrooms for 30 years. "Georgina, was it?" he said, swirling wine in his glass. "My nephew rarely brings anyone to these events. You must be very special to him." "I hope so," she said carefully, aware of every set of eyes in the ballroom tracking the exchange. "Be careful what you hope for in this family," Dae-sung said, still smiling, voice dropping just low enough that only she could hear. "Hope has a way of getting people killed around here." Georgina's blood ran cold, but before she could respond, Kang-woo appeared at her side, his hand finding the small of her back, steady and possessive. "Uncle, I see you've met Georgina." "I have. She's lovely." Dae-sung's eyes didn't warm at all, despite the compliment. "Fragile things often are." "She's not fragile," Kang-woo said, an edge entering his voice that made even the room's ambient chatter seem to hush. "She's the strongest person I know." Dae-sung raised his glass in a mock toast, but his gaze lingered on Georgina a moment too long before he turned away, a look that settled into her chest like a stone she couldn't shake for the rest of the night. "He doesn't like me," she whispered later, as Kang-woo walked her to the car. "He doesn't like anyone who might make me harder to control," Kang-woo said grimly. "For 20 years, my uncle has run half of this empire's real decisions from behind my chair. He built me into a weapon. He never expected the weapon to want something for itself." "Kang-woo." Georgina stopped walking, forcing him to face her fully. "Should I be afraid of him?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "Yes," Kang-woo said finally, quietly, like the admission cost him something. "You should be." He pulled her into a side alley away from the valet lights, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that contradicted every dangerous thing she'd ever heard whispered about him. "But I promise you this, nothing will touch you while I still have breath in my body. I have spent my whole life being the thing people fear. Let me finally use that for something worth protecting." Georgina wanted to believe him completely. But over the following weeks, small cracks began appearing in the fragile world they'd built, cracks that made her stomach twist with a dread she couldn't quite name. Her apartment door showed faint scuff marks one morning, like someone had tested the lock overnight. A black car idled outside the cleaning staff entrance for 3 days straight, then vanished without explanation. And once, walking home from a late shift, she was certain, absolutely certain, that footsteps had matched her pace for 2 full blocks before disappearing into the dark. "I think someone's watching me," she told Kang-woo one night, curled against his side on the leather sofa in his office, the city lights glittering beyond the window like scattered diamonds. His whole body went rigid. "Tell me exactly what you saw." She told him everything, the scuffed lock, the idling car, the footsteps. His jaw hardened into something carved from stone, and he was quiet for a long moment before he pressed a kiss to her temple, soft despite the fury simmering just beneath his calm. "I'll handle it," he said. "Kang-woo." "I said I'll handle it, Georgina." His voice was gentle even as his eyes burned. "Trust me." And she did. God help her, she did, completely and without reservation, because in a city that had never once made her feel like she belonged, this man, feared by an entire underworld, was the only person who made her feel entirely safe. That trust nearly cost her everything. 3 nights later, Georgina was walking to her apartment building when 2 men stepped out of the shadows, blocking her path. Her heart lurched into her throat. "Georgina Okafor," the taller one said, his Korean thickly accented, like he wasn't local either. "Choi Dae-sung sends his regards." Before she could scream, a hand clamped over her mouth, and everything went dark. She woke in a dim room that smelled of motor oil and damp concrete, wrists bound to a metal chair, her head throbbing where she must have hit something during the struggle. Across from her, Choi Dae-sung sat with the same practiced calm he'd worn at the gala, only now there was nothing warm pretending to be kindness in his expression. "I did try to warn you," he said, almost gently. "Hope gets people killed in this family. What do you want from me?" Georgina's voice shook, but she refused to let the terror swallow her whole. "I want my nephew back," Dae-sung said. For 25 years I built him into the perfect weapon, cold, precise, untouchable. And then a cleaning woman from Nigeria walked into his office and started making him soft. Do you understand what softness costs a man like Kang-woo? It costs him everything. His enemies smell weakness the way sharks smell blood. The moment they learn he has something to lose, they will come for it. For you. And when they take you from him, and they will, it will break him beyond repair. So your solution is to break me yourself? Before they get the chance. Dae-sung's smile was ice. My solution, Georgina, is to remove the variable entirely. Nothing personal. Merely inevitable. He nodded to one of the men behind her, who produced a phone and began recording. You're going to tell my nephew you're leaving him. That you used him for money, for status, for a foreign passport, whatever story keeps you both alive. He will grieve, as men like him do, briefly and privately, and then he will return to being exactly what I built him to be. You, meanwhile, will take a very generous payment and disappear back to Nigeria, never to return to Korea again. Refuse, and I promise you, the ending will be far less generous. Georgina's mind raced, terror and fury tangling together in her chest. She thought of her mother's face at the airport. She thought of Kang-woo's trembling hands the night he'd kissed her, the boy underneath the king who had never once, in 25 years, been allowed to simply want something for himself. No, she said, lifting her chin despite the tremor in her voice. Dae-sung's eyebrows rose. No. You can threaten me all you like, Georgina said, forcing steel into every word. But I will not lie to him. He spent his whole life being controlled by people who claimed to love him while they used him. I refuse to be one more person who breaks his trust to save myself. For a moment, something almost like respect flickered across Dae-sung's face, quickly buried beneath cold calculation. Admirable. Foolish, but admirable. He rose, straightening his jacket. Let's see how admirable you feel in a few hours. The door slammed shut, leaving Georgina alone in the dark with only her racing heartbeat and a single fierce prayer that Kang-woo would somehow, someway, find her before it was too late. What Dae-sung didn't know, what he'd never accounted for in 25 years of building his nephew into a weapon, was that Choi Kang-woo had installed a tracker in the phone he'd quietly given Georgina weeks earlier, the same night he'd promised nothing would touch her while he still had breath in his body. He hadn't told her. He'd told himself it was excessive, that she would think it controlling, that she deserved trust instead of surveillance. But some instinct, some scar tissue memory of losing his mother without warning, had refused to let him leave her unprotected in a city built on knives in the dark. When her signal stopped moving for 2 hours straight, that instinct screamed louder than reason. Find her, Kang-woo said, voice flat and terrible, to the 6 men assembled in his office. I don't care what it costs. I don't care whose name comes up. Find her now. Sir, one of his lieutenants said carefully, the signal is coming from a warehouse registered to Choi Dae-sung Shipping Company. The room went silent. Kang-woo's hands, braced against his desk, curled into fists so tight his knuckles turned white. My uncle, he said quietly, and something in his voice made every man in that room take an involuntary step back. He didn't remember the drive to the warehouse district. He remembered only the roaring in his ears, the years of buried grief and rage finally finding a single focused target. His mother had vanished when he was 9, and for 25 years he'd told himself it didn't matter, that a king didn't mourn a ghost he couldn't prove was murdered. But watching that on the tracking map stay motionless in a warehouse owned by the only family he had left, something inside him understood, with brutal clarity, exactly what had happened to her all those years ago, and exactly what his uncle intended to do again. Meanwhile, in the dim room, Georgina had stopped shaking. Fear had burned itself out somewhere in the second hour, leaving something harder in its place, the same steel that had carried her across an ocean with 2 suitcases and no safety net. When Dae-sung returned, his calm had frayed at the edges. You've had time to reconsider. I haven't, Georgina said. And I won't. Then you leave me no choice. He gestured, and the man with the phone stepped forward again. We'll simply record your refusal instead. My nephew will watch the woman he loves choose loyalty to him over her own survival. Do you understand what that will do to him? He will burn this city to the ground looking for me, and I will let him, right up until the moment he realizes I orchestrated your death to save him from himself. Grief makes men obedient again, Georgina. I learned that lesson raising him. You raised him with lies, Georgina spat, fury overtaking fear entirely now. You let him believe his mother abandoned him. You built a boy's whole identity around abandonment and called it strength. That's not love, Dae-sung. That's not even loyalty. That's just cruelty wearing a family name. Something flickered across Dae-sung's face, the first genuine crack in his composure. You know nothing about what I sacrificed to protect this family. I know you're about to kill an innocent woman to protect a lie, Georgina shot back. What does that make you protect, really? Not him. Just your own control. The warehouse door exploded inward before Dae-sung could respond. Kang-woo moved through the smoke and splintered wood like something not entirely human. Georgina would later swear she'd never seen a person move with such absolute, controlled violence, each step precise, each man who tried to stop him falling before they finished raising their weapon. His eyes found her first, bound to the chair, and something in his expression shattered and reformed all in the same instant, relief and rage so total it seemed to swallow the room whole. Kang-woo, she started. I'm here, he said, voice rough, already crossing the distance to cut her bindings with a blade that appeared in his hand like an extension of his fury. I'm here. I've got you. Dae-sung hadn't moved from where he stood, watching his nephew with something between fear and a strange, twisted pride. So the weapon finally learned to feel something, he said quietly. I always wondered what would happen the day it did. Kang-woo helped Georgina to her feet, positioning himself between her and his uncle with a stillness more terrifying than any shout could have been. You took her, he said. You took my mother, and now you tried to take her too. Dae-sung's mask finally, fully slipped. Your mother was going to destroy everything your father and I built. She wanted to take you away from this life, raise you soft, powerless, ordinary. I did what had to be done. I have always done what had to be done, Kang-woo, because someone in this family has to be strong enough to make the impossible choices. The confession landed in the room like a physical blow. Georgina felt Kang-woo's whole body go rigid beside her, 25 years of manufactured grief curdling instantly into something far more dangerous, the truth. You killed her, Kang-woo said, voice barely above a whisper. You killed my mother and let me believe she abandoned me. You let me spend my entire life believing I wasn't worth staying for. I made you strong, Dae-sung said. Look at what you are because of it. Look at what you made me become, Kang-woo said, and understand that it ends tonight. The room seemed to hold its breath. Georgina's hand found Kang-woo's, and even in the wreckage of that moment, the truth of his mother's murder laid bare, 25 years of grief finally given a name and a face. He held on to her like she was the only solid ground left in the world. Kang-woo, Georgina said quietly, don't let him make you into something else tonight. Don't let his cruelty write the next chapter of who you are. Dae-sung laughed, low and bitter. Listen to her. Still trying to save you, even now. Do you understand what you're choosing, nephew? Mercy is how kings fall. I taught you that. You taught me a great many things, Kang-woo said, his voice steadier now, the fury banking into something colder and far more controlled. But you never once taught me what it felt like to be cared for without condition. She did that. In 6 weeks, she gave me more truth than you gave me in 25 years. He turned to his men, who had fanned out through the warehouse, weapons trained on Dae-sung's remaining guards. Take him. Alive. He answers for my mother in front of the family council, not in a warehouse in the dark like a coward. You're making a mistake, Dae-sung snarled as 2 of Kang-woo's men seized his arms. No, Kang-woo said quietly. I'm finally correcting one. As Dae-sung was dragged away, still shouting threats that grew fainter as the warehouse door swallowed the sound, Kang-woo turned fully to Georgina, his composure finally cracking, hands shaking as he cupped her face and checked her over like he needed physical proof she was real and unbroken. I almost lost you, he said, voice raw. I promised you nothing would touch you, and I nearly failed that promise in the first month. You didn't fail, Georgina said, tears finally spilling now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go. You came. You always said trust was a knife pointed at you, but you trusted me enough to build a tracker into a phone instead of controlling every part of my life. That's not failure, Kang-woo. That's the first time someone protected me without trying to own me. He pressed his forehead to hers, breathing unsteady. "I love you," he said, the words clearly unfamiliar on his tongue, clumsy with disuse, but utterly certain. "I don't know how to do this, love, softness, any of it. I was never taught. But I know I would burn my entire empire to the ground before I let anyone take you from me." "Then let's build something different," Georgina whispered. "Not an empire built on fear. Something that's actually ours." The weeks that followed tested that promise in ways neither of them anticipated. Dae-sung's confession, once dragged in front of the family council, split the organization in two. Loyalists who'd quietly resented his manipulation for years rallied behind Kang-woo, while a smaller, more dangerous faction, unwilling to see their old power structure collapse, began making moves in the shadows. There were tense nights of negotiation, one failed assassination attempt on Kang-woo's convoy that left Georgina sick with terror until she saw him walk through the penthouse door unharmed, and a slow, painstaking dismantling of the lies his uncle had spent decades building. Through all of it, Georgina refused to disappear into the background the way Mrs. Han had once warned her fate demanded. She sat beside Kang-woo, not behind him, during council meetings that grew tense enough to feel like war rooms. She learned Korean at night, slowly, determinedly, so she'd never again feel locked out of a conversation that shaped her own life. And every single night, no matter how dark the day had been, Kang-woo held her like she was the only unbroken thing in a world built on broken promises. "You didn't just save my life that night in the warehouse," he told her one evening, months later, as they stood together on the same rooftop garden where he'd first confessed how thoroughly she'd unraveled him. "You saved 25 years of a life I didn't know how to live honestly. My mother tried to give me that once. My uncle took her before she could finish." Georgina laced her fingers through his, watching the Seoul skyline glitter beneath a sky finally, fully dark enough to reveal every star hiding behind the city lights. "Then let's finish what she started," she said. "Together." "Marry me," Kang-woo said suddenly, the words tumbling out unpolished and unplanned, nothing like the careful, controlled man the city feared. "I know it's fast. I know everyone will say you're either the bravest or the most reckless woman alive for saying yes to a man like me. But I have spent my entire life being feared, Georgina, and you are the only person who has ever simply stayed." Tears blurred Georgina's vision as she looked at him, this man the entire underworld called a monster, who was, underneath 25 years of manufactured armor, simply a boy who had never stopped waiting for someone to choose him without condition. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Kang-woo. 1,000 times yes." He kissed her then, slow and certain, nothing like the desperate, trembling kiss on the same rooftop months before. This one was steady, a promise instead of a question, sealed under a sky full of stars neither of them had believed they'd ever get to share. News of their engagement rippled through Seoul's underworld like a shockwave. Some called it madness. The king finally caught by a foreign cleaning woman who had no business surviving her first month in his world, let alone becoming his wife. Others, quietly, called it the first genuinely good thing to happen to the Choi family in a generation. Mrs. Han, of all people, wept openly when Georgina told her, pulling her into a fierce hug that smelled of lemon cleaning solution and 30 years of hard-won wisdom. "I told you not to look at him directly," Mrs. Han said, laughing through her tears. "I have never been so happy to be wrong." The wedding was small, deliberately so, Kang-woo's choice, a quiet rebellion against the lavish performative gatherings his uncle had once orchestrated to project power instead of joy. It was held in a private garden outside the city, string lights strung between cherry trees not yet in bloom. Close friends and the loyalists who'd stood by Kang-woo through the council's brutal restructuring gathered beneath a sky just beginning to soften into dusk. Georgina's mother, flown in from Lagos on a ticket Kang-woo had arranged without telling her, wept through the entire ceremony, gripping Gozi's hand so tightly her knuckles turned pale. "You said no one would hold you when you cried," her mother whispered to Georgina afterward, cupping her daughter's face just as Kang-woo had that very first night. "I was wrong to worry, my daughter. Look who found you instead." Kang-woo, standing beside his new wife in the fading light, still commanded the same quiet, dangerous authority that made grown men lower their eyes in boardrooms across the city. But when he looked at Georgina, hand resting protectively at the small of her back, eyes softened in a way no photograph of the feared Choi Kang-woo had ever captured before, the king of Seoul's underworld looked, for the first time in 25 years, entirely and unguardedly at peace. "They'll write stories about tonight," Georgina murmured against his shoulder as they danced beneath the cherry trees, "about the cleaner who kissed the Mafia king and lived. Let them, Kang-woo said, pressing a kiss to her temple, holding her like she was the single truest thing he'd ever been allowed to keep. Because the story isn't about how I ruled an empire built on fear. It's about the woman who taught me that love was never the weakness my uncle claimed it to be. It was the only thing strong enough to save me. Choi Dae-sung remained locked away under permanent council custody, his empire of manipulation dismantled piece by piece by the very nephew he'd tried to weaponize into something incapable of love. And Georgina Okafor, once a girl with 2 suitcases and a promise to herself that she would not return home broken, became the one person in all of Seoul's underworld who had walked directly into the lion's den, wielded nothing but honesty and unshakable courage, and emerged not just alive, but utterly, completely loved. Because sometimes the most powerful man in the world isn't undone by rivals, bullets, or betrayal. Sometimes he's simply waiting, quietly, desperately, for someone brave enough to see past the fear everyone else feels, and love the person hiding underneath it.